Hi guys, I'm Julianne from 𝗀𝗪𝗚, and today we're sewing a hobby horse together. The whole thing is based on our sewing pattern for hobby horse Holly, which you can find on 𝗀𝗪𝗘𝗥𝗡, Etsy.com or 𝗀𝗪𝗚.�ca. In this video, I go through the instructions with you step by step and also show you various tips and tricks. We also have lots of individual videos on this YouTube channel where we explain, for example, how to sew a great standing mane for fjord hobby horse or how to sew on synthetic hair extensions as a mane. I will also give you various tips in this video so that your hobby horse sewing goes really well, and I'd say we'll start right away. First, I'll show you everything you need to sew a hobby horse. First of all, of course, you need the fabric. I'm going to sew a dapple grey horse from our silver grey snuggly fabric and also a fjord horse using our beige shorty fabric. The fjord horse will get a different coloured muzzle, and for that I will use our super soft shorty in ivory. You will also need black felt for the eyes and nostrils or any other non-fraying black fabric. Next thing you need is a double-sided iron-on adhesive webbing to applique the eyes, nostrils, and the blaze, for example, hidden bond or bonder-web. We will use this later to iron the eyes and these other elements onto the fabric and then sew it in place. In principle, this is a good help to prevent these small elements from slipping when sewing them in place. To reinforce the ears and the inside of the mouth, you will need a medium weight iron-on interfacing. I will use something called H250 from the brand of Lizzline here, but you can use any medium weight interfacing that's available in your country. As I sew with a higher pile plush fabric, I also need a transparent, water-soluble embroidery film. The one I use is called Avalon Film Foil. I will place this on top of the fabric when sewing the appliques in place. Then the seam looks a bit nicer, and I stick some self-adhesive embroidery stabilizer to the back of the fabric so that the seam doesn't warp and appliques look nice and clean. Here I have some white embroidery floss for the eye twinkles. This is basically a hand embroidery thread, and I use it to sew on these bright dots of light in the eyes with a hand sewing needle. If you prefer to paint the eyes with fabric paint instead of embroidering the light dots with embroidery floss, or if you want to shade your hobby horse in general, you will need fabric paint and a sponge. We have made an extra video in which I explain exactly how the painting of the eyes and the shading of the fur works. If you want to give your hobby horse a mane of yarn, you will of course need the appropriate yarn. Alternatively, you can also use artificial hair extensions. We'll show you exactly how this works in a separate video. And of course, you'll also need a stick to attach your hobby horse to. I always buy a normal broomstick at the hardware store and then simply saw it in half. Then you get a very good length for your hobby horse, and you can always shorten that a little bit more if necessary. To attach this stick to the horse, you also need a cord. I prefer to use polypropylene rope because on the one hand, you can singe the ends with a lighter, and on the other, it is the least sensitive to dirt, at least according to our test. Alternatively, you can of course also use a cotton cord or thick wool. It's up to you. The tools and basic materials you need are sewing thread, a hand sewing needle, and of course a lot of pins because we have a lot to pin. And I always use a water-soluble fabric marker to transfer the pattern onto my fabrics, as I find this the easiest ones to use with our minky plush fabrics. You will also need glue to glue the cord from the stick into the stick afterwards. To stuff your hobby horse, you will of course also need a lot of fibre fill or any other batting material, about 500 grams or approximately 1 pound. Okay, I now have my paper sewing pattern here that you can buy from our shop and then print out yourself. Maybe as a little tip, I always glue my paper patterns onto cardboard. Especially if you work with a fabric marker that has a lead like this one, you can trace it much better because you can press the lead against the cardboard edge. So that's just a little tip. Now I'm going to draw all the printed pattern pieces onto my plush fabric. For this, I have my cuddly plush fabric here, and I'm now tracing the pattern onto the smooth side, i.e. the wrong side of the fabric. And off I go, I would say. What's important is that you transfer these markings that you find here on the pattern piece to the fabric. This will help you later when sewing and positioning the individual parts. For the darts here at the top and also for the muzzle opening, we have to make an incision. I always do this by marking the beginning of the dart or incision here on the edge of the pattern piece, and then I punch a small hole in the paper pattern piece here at the end or tip of the incision, and then I trace this hole to the fabric using my fabric marker. And when I take the pattern piece away, I simply connect the beginning and end of the dart with the ruler. I'll do exactly the same here again for the muzzle opening. And here at this corner point for the seam, I also have to transfer this point to the fabric. This is extremely important later when we sew the muzzle into this opening, as the corner point will help us with this tricky task. So I have now transferred all the pattern pieces onto my fabric except for the ears and the muzzle, because these parts need to be reinforced with interfacing. I'll show you how to do that later. But first I'll cut out the other parts. I cut them out with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, which is about 5/8 of an inch. That means that I will cut with an approximate 1 centimeter distance to these pre-drawn lines. If you are sewing by hand, because I know that a lot of hobby horses are sewn by hand, you can choose a smaller seam allowance. But if you are sewing with a sewing machine, as we are doing today, then definitely add a centimeter seam allowance, because with this you are on the safe side that nothing will rip open. For the muzzle, I now make this incision I have talked about before, because then I can cut it out a little bit better. Right to the end. And then you have this small offset here because the upper part of the mouth protrudes a little. Then you can cut it off better. And here's the ear dart. You can also simply cut this right to the end. And this is what the cut piece looks like. For the ears and muzzle, you should reinforce the plush fabric with an interfacing. I have H250 here. This is a relatively thin interfacing, so it doesn't add any volume, but it is not elastic. And that is actually the most important thing. For the muzzle, the piece of fabric should not stretch when you stuff the muzzle. Otherwise, you will get a bulge inside the muzzle, which doesn't look great, and you should reinforce the ears so that they really stick out nicely from the head. So I'm just going to iron this onto the fabric here, and then I'll transfer the pattern pieces onto the interfacing. I use a damp cloth. It's already a bit damaged because I always use it for ironing, but it actually works best with that. Once you have ironed on the interfacing and it has bonded nicely with the fabric and the whole thing has cooled down, you can actually transfer the pattern pieces, the ears 4 times and the inside of the muzzle once. I have decided on using the sew-in ears for the grey hobby horse, so those will be sewn into the dart. With the small fjord horse, I will sew the ears on by hand after finishing the horse, but now in this case I'm using the ears for sewing in. And I just draw them onto the fabric. Here with the muzzle piece, you have to transfer these corner points for the seam again. I have punched holes for this into the paper pattern piece. And so I can now transfer these 2 points from the pattern piece onto the fabric. Then trace it again. And now I can cut the whole thing out. It is very important that the inside of the muzzle, i.e. this muzzle piece here, is cut without any further seam allowance. In other words, you cut it out directly along this transferred outline. And you can cut the ears as normal, just like the other pattern pieces, with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. I showed you my little fjord horse with the cute standing mane earlier, and as mentioned before, I reduced the size of the pattern for it so that it comes out a little bit smaller, and I reduced it to 85%. So this is the original size of the pattern piece, and this one I simply reduced it to 85% when I printed it out. You can then glue it together and stick it onto the cardboard in exactly the same way as with the large one, but then you have a much smaller horse, which is certainly quite cool. Of course, it's a bit less heavy if you have a smaller child, or you can make yourself a kind of foal, which I'm sure lots of people will love, and that's why we're making this smaller version. Feel free to print the pattern at any scale you like. In this smaller fjord horse version, as you saw in the pictures earlier, the muzzle is a different color. This means that there is a line integrated into the pattern. I used to call it a cutting edge, where you can divide the pattern pieces, so to speak. And so you can sew the muzzle in a different color to the rest of the horse's head. And this is the case on a total of 3 pattern pieces. So you have a cutting edge here on the head side piece, then here on the forehead gusset, and here on the lower gusset. In principle, you first print out all pattern pieces and then glue them together. And then you cut the pattern pieces along these cutting edges into 2 pieces each. This way you can cut the now separated muzzle pieces from a different colored fabric. And that's exactly what I'm doing now. So we've now cut out all the pieces, and here you can see them again in the overview. The first picture shows all pieces for the grey hobby horse, and then the second picture shows all the pieces for the little fjord horse. If you would like to shade your horse, as you can see it here, for example with these dots for a dapple grey hobby horse, or these shadings behind the eyes, then I recommend that you do this directly after cutting. For one thing, if it doesn't work, then it's not the complete finished horse that is disfigured because you only messed up cut fabric pieces. Secondly, especially with the eyes, it looks better if you do it before the eyes are sewn on and ironed on. If you do it afterwards, that works too, but then you always have a small uncolored area, especially if the plush is a bit longer like the one I use here. That's why I also shaded this area around the muzzle a bit in advance, because it's a 5mm plush, and when you sew it together without shading first, you will always see a few light areas. So if you want to do some shadings, now is the right time. We've made an extra video for this, which we'll also link you to, so you can just take a look at the other, also very detailed video, and then do the shading. Next, we continue with the eyes and nostrils, including the blaze, and we have to transfer these elements to a double-sided iron-on adhesive webbing like heat and bond. Those double-sided iron-on adhesive webbings are available from many other brands, for example 𝗫𝗪𝗪, 𝗫𝗪𝗪, or 𝗫𝗪𝗪𝗪. So you have different options depending on what's available in your area, but the principle is the same for all of them. You have a double-sided webbing, just like a double-sided tape, and you can use it to iron pieces of fabric onto fabric. The way it works is that I place webbing with the webbing side facing down onto this template from the printed pattern, and then I transfer the eyes and the nostrils and also a blaze onto the backing paper of the webbing. There is always one side that has the webbing and one side that has a foil or backing paper on it, on which you can draw your motif. So I'm going to draw the eyes and nostrils first, and then this short forehead blaze here for my dapple grey hobby horse. He'll get a little forehead blaze like this under his forelock because I think it will look pretty cute. And this is what it looks like when it's all transferred to the webbing. Theoretically, you can also come up with any other shape for the blaze. For example, I have another one here. It's a bit longer and it's wider at the bottom in the muzzle area. You are completely free to come up with your own ideas for your hobby horse's blaze. And these individual elements, I'll now cut them out roughly so that I can iron them onto the corresponding fabrics. First, I'll iron the eyes and nostrils onto black felt. To do this, I position these pieces of webbing here with the rough coated webbing side downwards onto the felt and iron the whole thing in place for a few seconds until it sticks really well. And I do the same with the nostrils. I now do the same with the webbing piece for the blaze. However, as I make the blaze from an ivory piece of plush fabric, I will iron it onto the back of the fabric. You can also shade this piece of fabric for the blaze with a pink fabric paint beforehand. We'll show you exactly how to do this in the separate video about the shading that I mentioned before. So once you've prepared the blaze fabric like this, you can iron the prepared piece of webbing onto the wrong side of the fabric, and then you have a light pink gradient which imitate these furless areas on the muzzle of a horse. Now you can cut out the elements along the lines you have drawn. can remove the backing paper or foil from the webbing. Now you have a webbing layer on the fabric which will become adhesive when heated up, so we can now iron the pieces onto the head side pieces and the forehead gusset. If you now want to paint these felt eyes with fabric paint, as you can see here in this example, then you should do this now. Before you remove the backing paper from the adhesive webbing and before you iron the eyes onto the headpiece. We have made an extra video for this and we will add the link to this video for you. This way you can watch it separately to see how to paint the eyes. When sewn on, the painted eyes will look like this. In the linked video, we also show you how to add these extra shadings around the eyes to give the whole thing a bit more depth and an even more realistic look. In this current video, however, we will iron on the unpainted eyes and then embroider the eye twinkles with embroidery floss. To iron on the eyes and nostrils in the right place, you can make a small positioning aid. To do this, take the pattern piece and simply cut out the eyes and nostrils from it using small pointed scissors. And then you can place the pattern piece on the right side of the fabric, like this, and trace these holes as outlines. And now you know the exact positions of your eyes and nostrils. Of course, you also have to do this for the second head side piece and also for the blaze if you need to. This makes it easier to iron it in place in the next step. You can now place the eye with this coated side down exactly on this preliminary drawing. And then simply iron the whole thing in place with light pressure. And of course you do the same with the nostrils. I'll also do the same with the blaze on the forehead gusset. Now we can sew the ironed on pieces of fabric in place in the next step. First, I sew the eyes and nostrils in place using a simple straight stitch as close as possible to the edge of the felt. Make sure your thread has the same color as the felt. This is what it looks like now, and the threads here, I simply pull them through to the back and then tie them in a knot. Now I do the same with the nostrils. Especially if you have such tight curves, like here with the nostrils, you should lift the presser foot with the needle down in the fabric, then turn the whole thing and continue sewing. This way you can sew these tight curves much better. Next, I sew the blaze in place, and I do this with a zigzag stitch, but feel free to use a straight stitch here too if your fabric doesn't fray. Because the fabric is pushed a little more with the zigzag stitch than if I just used a straight stitch, I stick some embroidery stabilizer onto the back of the forehead gusset. I use this one, which is called Cotton Fix. This ensures that the fabric is simply a little firmer and a little more stabilized. I then place a small piece of Avalon film foil on top. This is the water-soluble embroidery film I mentioned in the beginning, and it simply pushes the hairs of the plush down a little. This means that the seam looks much cleaner. I have now selected a zigzag stitch on my sewing machine with a stitch width of 3 and a stitch length of 0.7. This means that the stitch is not quite as tight. But it doesn't need to be, because the plush fabric doesn't fray at the edges, and this way you simply get a nicer seam. If your fabrics frays, use a much smaller stitch length, like 0.4 or shorter. Now I can remove the Avalon film foil and the embroidery stabilizer. And with that, my blaze applique is finished. Next, I embroider the eye twinkle, this white dot which is located approximately here. I do this using some hand embroidery floss. This one here is a hand embroidery thread which is much thicker than sewing thread, so I don't need as many stitches. If I were to use simple sewing thread, I would probably spend an hour embroidering the white eye twinkles. The embroidery floss has much more threads and is a bit thicker, so it doesn't take that long to embroider areas like this. And now I just cut off a piece about 20 centimeters long and tie a knot in the end. And then I pull this embroidery floss onto a hand sewing needle. And now I embroider a small round area here. I do this by placing lots of parallel stitches next to each other. They should be very close so that they form a circle. The embroidered eye twinkle looks like. I have tied the thread at the back of the fabric and cut it off, and now the first eye twinkle is finished, and I'll do exactly the same for the other eye. If you have cut the muzzle part out of a different colored fabric, as is the case with my fjord horse, then the next step is to sew these separated muzzle elements to the other pieces. Don't be confused, this is actually the first step in our sewing instructions. And then the eyes and nostrils are ironed on. In principle, the order doesn't matter, you can do it however it suits you best. I did the shadings for my 𝗀𝗲𝗧 first and ironed the eyes because I simply shaded this area here a little white so that the transition to the white muzzle isn't so hard. But feel free to sew the muzzle to the head first and then shade it and add the eyes and nostrils, whatever you prefer or makes more sense to you. But just don't be confused that the written sewing instructions have a different order. Now to sew this together, simply place the pieces right sides together and pin the fabric edges together. I always do this on the outside first so that the edges are exactly on top of each other, and then I pin the rest. Perhaps a little tip on pinning. I always pin the pins in a way so that they come out at the pattern outline I have drawn. This allows me to check from the other side whether the pins are also coming out on this line, and this means that both pattern pieces are positioned exactly on top of each other, which is what we want. Now we sew the pieces together along the pinned edges. Next up are the ears. My dapple grey hobby horse will have ears that are sewn into the ear darts that we have cut into the head side pieces. For the 𝗀𝗲𝗧, I sew the ears on by hand after sewing the whole horse together and stuffing it. There are these two variants in our sewing pattern, so you can decide which one you prefer. The only is that when the ears are sewn in, they stand a little further apart, and when they are sewn on by hand afterwards, they simply stand a little closer together, and this changes the horse's expression a little. In this video, I'm going to do both so you can see for both variants how it works. The 𝗀𝗲𝗧 gets the ears sewn on after stuffing, and the grey horse gets the ears sewn into the ear darts. For both variants, I'm going to pin the fabric pieces for the ears together, right sides facing. Now we can sew the ears together. Make sure that the bottom edge of the pinned ears stay open for turning them. Now before I can turn the ears, I have to trim the seam allowances. This means I have to cut small notches here on these outer curves and a few straight cuts here on this inner curve. I will also cut back the seam allowance at the top as much as I can, so right up to the seam. This way there is only little fabric here on this tip after turning. If there would be too much fabric from the seam allowance, I wouldn't be able to shape this tip nicely. Now that all the seam allowances have been trimmed, we can turn the ears. I now shape the tip of the ears really well with a pointed object, in this case my scissors, but be careful to not poke through the fabric. For the sewn-in ears, I now have to make the 2 folds. You have 2 markings for this on the wrong side of the fabric, 2 A markings. These should be approximately at the height where the seam allowance ends, at least if you have cut with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. At this marking, you now need to fold the outer edges towards the center. Like this. It is important that these folds do not overlap, otherwise you will end up with too many layers of fabric and your sewing machine will not be able to sew them together properly. As you can see, the seam edges here meet exactly. And I'll just pin this in place with fabric clips. To make sure that the folds can't slip when we sew the ears in later, I'll sew the folds in place with a seam just inside the area of the seam allowance. Now we have to sew the ears into the ear seams, of course, only if you have opted for the sew-in ears and not the ones that are sewn on by hand after stuffing the horse. But in the case of my dapple grey hobby horse here, I opted for the sew-in ears, and they now have to be sewn into this dart at the top of the head side pieces. To do this, I take the ear and place it here on the edge of the dart fabric. It is important that this inner curve of the ear, which you can see here, points upwards to the top of the head. So don't sew in the ears this way, because then the ears will stick out later. That's not what we want. Instead, this inner curve has to point upwards. Now that I've placed the ear at the dart, I then fold the head fabric over so that here at the dart, the edges of the fabric lie exactly on top of each other. Now the first thing I do is to put a small pin in the top here. And now I push the ear again here through the dart. This can be up to 1/6 of an inch or 5 millimeters out of the dart, because the dart is only sewn together with a seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. And then I pin the rest together so that the ear can't slip away from the dart and stays in place. And now I sew the dart together using a seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. When sewing in the ears, it is important that you sew slowly. The fabric is probably very thick at this point. The reinforcement of the ears and the folds that we have created here make it really bulky, and it simply helps me if I sew relatively slowly and also push or pull a little with my fingers to sew over all the layers of fabric. With the version where the ears are sewn on by hand afterwards, we obviously can't sew ears into this dart right now. Nevertheless, the dart must be sewn closed. To do so, you fold the head side fabric at the dart, just like the version with the sewn-in ears, and pin the edges of the fabric together at the dart. And then sew the dart together with a seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. Next, I sew the forehead gusset together with the main gusset to create one long piece. To do this, simply put the pieces together, right sides facing. There is a mark with the letter G on both pieces of fabric for orientation. This means that both G marks have to lie exactly on top of each other, and then you pin the whole fabric edge together. Now we can sew this together along the pinned edge. If you want to add a yarn main to your hobby horse, then I would recommend that you pull in the base thread at this point. The base thread is the thread to which all the individual strands of yarn will be tied later. The advantage of adding this thread now is that you can pull the thread through from the wrong side of the fabric to the front. This means that you won't have a visible knot on the outside of your horse later. That's why I'm adding this base thread now. I am cutting a long piece of yarn first. This is the same yarn I want to use for the whole mane. If you don't yet know exactly what color you want for the mane, you can simply use a thread that is the same color as your hobby horse fabric. This means that it doesn't matter whether you decide on a black or a white mane, as the base thread will be the same color as the horse fur, so it won't stand out at all. I now make a thick knot in this thread. And I'm going to pull the thread onto a hand sewing needle. If you don't have such a great thick needle as I do, but you are using a thick yarn, then I would recommend that you simply use a thinner thread, embroidery floss for example. I have done this with other manes that I have sewn and it works great too, but in our case now I have a really nice thick needle where the thread fits through easily, and now I can simply pull it through the fabric. It's important that the thread is at least as long as the main gusset, preferably another 4 inches or 10 centimeters longer, then you're on the safe side. Now I'm going to stitch this thread through at the main marking that you can find on the pattern piece. I transferred this marking from the paper pattern piece to the fabric when I cut it out, and now I'll simply stitch the thread through from the wrong side of the fabric to the right side. Make sure that the knot is securing the thread. And that's basically it. I now take the needle off again. And now I'll just tape the thread here onto the fabric so that it doesn't get caught in the seam later. Now the base thread for the mane is finished, and now I need another base thread for the forelock. For that, I have to position a strand of yarn here as a loop so that I can then tie the individual strands for the forelock to this loop. Here too, I'm threading a piece of the yarn that I will use for the forelock onto a hand sewing needle. I make a nice knot at the end. And then I stitch the needle right here at the seam between the forehead gusset and the main gusset from the back to the front of the fabric, approximately in the middle. Now I need a loop like this. It should be about 1 inch or 3 centimeters long from the seam to the middle of the loop. I'm going to hold on to this a little bit and just stitch the thread back onto the wrong side of the fabric. I stitch back at the same position, or really close to the same position where I had stitched out the first time. Like this. And then I knot it on the back, preferably within the seam allowance of this seam up here. Now I'm I'm going to tape this loop in place with a bit of adhesive tape to make sure it can't get caught in the seam. The upper gusset is now ready to be sewn in. Now we can sew the upper gusset and the first head side piece together. You can already see this roughly here. The gusset must be sewn on with this edge to this edge of the head side piece here. There are various markings that will help you to pin it together correctly. Firstly, of course, the bottom edge of the gusset has to line up with the bottom edge of the head piece. Then there is a C marking on both pieces. They have to be placed on top of each other. Then this dot must line up with the seam between the main gusset and the forehead gusset. And there is also B mark on both pieces, which must also be exactly on top of each other. Here at the front of the mouth, the edge of the fabric here from the upper gusset must end with this opening here. And I would say I'll just start and pin the two pieces together at exactly these points. Once you've pinned it together at these points, you can pin the entire remaining edge of the fabric together between the pins you've already inserted. This is what the two fabric pieces will look like once they are pinned together. If you started with the same head side piece as I did, you will have a marked turning opening here. This means you'll have to leave it out when sewing gusset and head together. And now I'm going to my sewing machine and sew everything together along the pinned edge. This is what the whole thing looks like sewn together. And in the same way, I'll now sew the second head side piece to the gusset. If you are sewing the version with the different colored muzzle, it is important that you pin the seam between the different colored parts exactly on top of each other. In other words, this seam on the upper gusset must match the seam on the head side piece exactly. I always pin this part together first and then the rest. The upper gusset is now sewn in, and so the next step is to sew in the lower gusset. The principle of sewing in the lower gusset is actually exactly the same as for the upper gusset, but there is one big difference, and that is that we sew the lower gusset on in 2 steps. This is mainly due to the fact that there is a very pointed inner corner. And to be able to sew this corner correctly, we first sew only the first part up to the E marking. And then we pin and sew the second part in place. So basically you do the same as with the upper gusset. We first pin at the prominent points, i.e. at marking E, F, and here at the front of the muzzle opening. And then we pin the rest of the fabric edge between the E mark and the muzzle. Here's a little tip to make sure you really hit these E markings exactly on both fabric pieces. I always take a needle and push it through the E marking on one fabric piece, and then check whether it comes out exactly at the E mark on the other fabric piece. That's not the case now, so I just move it a little so that my needle goes right through the E mark. And then I push the needle through really firmly, and now I know, okay, the two marks match exactly. And now I pin the fabric layers together in this position. And now I pin the remaining markings. Now I sew the pinned edge together right up to mark E. This means that I end the seam exactly at E mark or start exactly there depending on how you have pinned. This is really important so that we can turn the gusset downwards later. So sew from E to the end. Once again, if you are working with the split muzzle, the seams must meet exactly at this point so that you have a nice transition of all fabric pieces later. To make it easier to sew on the second part of the gusset and lay it around like this, we have to make an incision on the head side fabric just before the E marking. This way it's easier to pull the fabric apart and to position the fabric edges on top of each other. And now you can already see that this can now be laid on top of each other really well, and then we simply pin the remaining edge of the fabrics together. When pinning, try to make sure that you don't have any folds on either fabric layer that you would be sewing into place. For this, I always pull the head side fabric a little bit away from the seam end here and then put another pin in here. Then both fabric layers are really flat here and there are no folds that I would accidentally sew in. Now let's sew again exactly from the E marking, i.e. exactly where the first seam ends or started. We will sew from there right to the end of the gusset. You should now check the seam at the head side piece to mask sure you have sewn in enough of the fabric at the E marking. I don't know if you can see it properly on the camera, but I'm very close to this incision here at the E mark. That's why I'm going to go a little further out with the seam from this side of the fabric so that the fabric doesn't tear out later on the finished stuffed horse. And then we can sew the second head side piece to the lower gusset just like we did with the first head piece. This is what the head looks like when the lower gusset is sewn on. And just as we did with the first head side piece, we now sew this gusset to the second head side piece. In other words, first sew this one section up to the E marking, then cut this seam allowance here from the head side piece, and then finish sewing in this direction. Now we come to the trickiest part of the whole sewing instructions. We have to sew this inner muzzle or mouthpiece into this opening. Why is this so tricky? For one thing, we only have a very small seam allowance here, namely 3/16 of an inch or 0.5 centimeters. If the seam allowance is larger, the mouth will be relatively wide open afterwards. We don't want that, which is why we have such a small seam allowance. And again, we have an inside corner that is relatively sharp at the end of this incision, and that makes the whole thing relatively tricky. But I have a few little tricks that you can use to get it right anyway. The best way to start is to simply push this inner part of the mouth into the muzzle opening, right sides facing. This marked lower center should now be in the middle of the lower gusset, and this is where you position the first pin. To sew in the inner part of the mouth, we will sew in 2 steps. First the lower part and then the upper part of the mouth. We start by sewing mouth and head side piece together by hand at the corner point for seam marking, which you can find on the head side piece and also on this inner mouth piece. This step should help to ensure that this inner mouth piece doesn't slip when sewing. And that's why I'm going to take some embroidery floss, or you can also use sewing thread, and thread it onto a hand sewing needle. Then I knot the end. And now the first thing I do is stitch through this corner point for seam marking seam on the head side piece. From the wrong side of the fabric to the right side. I pull it through and pull it tight. And now I stitch through the inner mouth piece. At the same marking, this time from the right side of the fabric to the wrong side. Exactly where I have this cross marking here. Now pull the whole thing tight. And to hold it in place, I stitch back again. Just really close to this point. Now I pull this back a bit more and knot the thread. Now we've got these markings exactly on top of each other, and we know that we can pin the rest of the fabric edge from here. But before, of course, I'll do exactly the same on the other side. I pin the entire lower edge of the fabric from corner point to corner point. And now I sew the inside of the mouth together along this pinned edge from corner point to corner point, and importantly, only with a seam allowance of 3/16 of an inch or 0.5 centimeters. The smaller the seam allowance, the less the mouth will stay open afterwards. The lower part of the inner mouthpiece is now firmly sewn. It's best to check the back again to make sure that you've really sewn the fabric everywhere, because the seam allowance is so small that something can slip out. I have also sewn a little more in one place here, but it should be good now. Now we have to sew the upper part together with the upper muzzle opening. So that we can lay the edges of the fabric nicely on top of each other, we have to make another small incision, exactly at the point where we sewed the two pieces of fabric together by hand using this seam corner marking. And now I can pin the upper edge of the inner mouthpiece together with the fabric edge of the head side piece and the gusset here. It is important to sew exactly from corner to corner again. Try to make sure that you don't have any folds at this point on the back, otherwise you will of course sew the folds in place at the same time. I always do this by pulling it a little taut here and then just sticking a pin in again. And then I don't have any creases in this area. Now I can sew the whole thing together again with our reduced seam allowance. This is what the finished sewn-in inner mouthpiece looks like. As you can see from my seams, I have actually made a few corrections. That's simply down to the fabric. I used our Snuggly plush fabric, and because of the longer pile and the fact that it is pretty stretchy, I had to make a few adjustments. But the good thing is that you won't see it in the end. So everything is tip-top. That's how it looks now, and all that's missing is the bottom of the horse. I now have the parts for the bottom, which consists of two pieces of fabric. They are now sewn together, right sides facing, at this edge in the center. This area here remains open as the stick will be inserted here later, and this curved edges here will be sewn into the head. We now put this together, right sides facing, and pin it together at these straight edges. Now we can sew it together along the pinned edges. And importantly, this must remain open. This is where the stick will come through later. Now I'm going to cut the seam allowance here in these corners with a straight cut right up to the seam. The bottom of the horse is now finished. Now I can sew the bottom down here into the opening of the head. There is a D mark on the bottom for this. It's here on this seam edge and it meets the D mark from the lower gusset. The other side of the bottom here at this seam is pinned together with the center of the main gusset. And I will first pin bottom and head together at these 2 points and then the rest of the fabric edge. Now I can sew around the entire bottom. That was the last thing we actually sewed with the sewing machine, and now I trim all the seam allowances. This is what the hobby horse looks like when it's sewn together, and now we can turn the horse out. If you want to shade your hobby horse even more now, i.e. especially here in the throat, or add a darker area to the jaws so that the face is just a little more angular, then stuff the hobby horse without the stick for now. The reason for that is that you can then shade the stuffed horse, but then you can remove the fiber fill and fix the fabric paint in the oven. We will show you exactly how this works in another video, which we have linked in the caption of this video. If you don't want to fix the fabric paint or don't want to shade your horse at all, that's fine too. Then the next step is stuffing and attaching the stick. My little horse is now fresh out of the oven and has taken a few more hours to dry before I can now start stuffing it. Before I do that, however, I sew the muzzle together by hand with a few stitches. The reason for this is that I don't want the inside of the muzzle to bulge outwards when stuffing, because then the mouth is always a bit open and I don't want that. I want it to lie nice and flat on top of each other. So I simply threaded a needle and now I'm just sewing around the muzzle opening with a few stitches. Now it's time to start stuffing, and the first thing we're going to do is stuff this part of the horse's head. The background to this is that the stick has to go in here, and that's why we're only going to stuff this side first. have a little tip for you regarding stuffing your horse. I always say that well stuffed is half sewn. This means that you can influence the shape of the horse or any stuffed animal quite a bit with the way you stuff the fiber fill into it, not only in areas where you may not have sewn a curve so well, but also concerning the overall shape. Depending on how much filling you stuff into the head and also where you stuff it, in which part of the head, you can change the shape and look of the horse. You can see here, for example, that the head is stuffed relatively flat, so there is no outward shape to be seen at all. And I'll just show you in comparison what it looks like if I stuff the head a little more, and you'll see that it changes the shape and therefore the overall look quite a lot. Which one you like more is totally up to you. Just take your time when stuffing and pay attention to the shape. So here you can see the comparison. I have stuffed a lot more fiber fill into the eye area, and you can see that this gives the head a lot more volume. Of course, this is also due to the fact that my plush fabric is a bit elastic. This means that if you have reinforced it with an interfacing, this effect will probably not be as pronounced. But if the fabric is stretchy, i.e. unreinforced, then you can really do a lot to the shape with putting more or less batting in. I have now stuffed half of my horse's head and can now prepare the stick. The stick is then inserted through the turning opening to the bottom through this stick opening. However, to prevent the stick from slipping back and forth inside the horse, we first have to create a kind of stopper this stick. I will show you how to do this. I've got my broomstick here and I'm going to attach the stopper on one side. This will keep the stick from spinning inside the head. To create such a stopper, you'll need batting or stuffing material, preferably something like this. It is connected in layers and I can wrap it nicely around the stick. Most of the time, the fiber fill you use for stuffing soft toys comes in small tufts, and as you can see, it's relatively difficult to wrap it around here and attach it. So it's basically possible, but it's much easier to create the stopper if you have a layered batting material. Alternatively, you could also use a thick interfacing. This is really one of the thickest things you can get, I think. And you can just wrap this around the stick until a nice thick stopper has formed. But as I said, I will now use the layered batting to create the stopper. And to prevent it from coming off the stick, I first apply a bit of glue to the end of the stick, about 4 inches or 10 centimeters. And then I wrap my batting material around the stick end. So that the wrapped batting can't slip and is properly secured and doesn't come undone, I'll tie it down with a rope or a small cord. You can also use a piece of yarn. The first end of the cord is now knotted, and then I wrap the cord around the entire part of the stick that I have wrapped with batting material. Now I can knot the two ends together again. The stopper is now finished, and once the glue has dried, we can put the stick into the hobby horse. You now guide the lower end of the stick from the top through the turning opening, down through the opening in the bottom of the horse. Then push it through until the stopper reaches the turning opening. Now you have to carefully put the fabric over it. Now that you have the stick with the stopper inside the horse, try to position the stopper roughly in this area here. And now you can stuff more fiber fill around the stick until the entire horse is stuffed and has a nice even shape. This is what my finished stuffed hobby horse looks like. Once again, a note on the shape and stuffing. You can really do a lot to the shape with the stuffing. It is important that the most pointed area is here at the top and that it then goes down rather flat along the back and that it doesn't get a hump here because then it looks like a humpy horse. So up here it has to be nicely pointed and make sure down here the jaw is shaped out well. Then I would say we can now remove this auxiliary thread at the mouth and then I sew the turning opening closed with a ladder stitch. This is what my stuffed horses look like now, but before 𝗀𝗲𝗪𝗓 gets his ears, we have to wrap a rope around the fabric at the opening for the stick. Firstly, this rope is an aesthetic matter as it will hide the fabric at the stick opening, so it just looks a bit nicer in my opinion. Secondly, it also gives the stick a bit more stability so that it doesn't wobble back and forth when riding. To hide the fabric at the stick opening, you first need the rope or cord. I have a PP rope here which is similar to paracord but made from a different material. It's about 4 millimeters in diameter and I'm going to wrap it around the opening right here. You can also use cotton cord for example, but then you have to glue the beginning of the cord to the fabric. Here with my PP rope, it's actually quite cool that I can simply singe the beginning with a lighter. I now sew it down by hand with a few stitches right here at the edge where the actual bottom of the horse starts. Now I can wrap this rope around the fabric, keeping it nice and tight, and I'll glue the rope down with some hot glue every few turns. Now wrap the rope up to about 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter below the edge of the fabric and glue it to the wood so that the rope can't slip and is nice and sturdy. Now that I have reached my desired the end of the wrapped area, I cut the rope at about 1 inch or 2 to 3 centimeters after the last part that I have glued down. Then I singe the end of my rope. Theoretically, you could now just glue it down like this, but I'm going to show you another variation, which is that I'm going to drill a small hole here into the stick using my drill, about 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter deep. And then I put a bit of hot glue into the hole and stick the end of the rope into it. Then I have a really nice and durable finish of this wrapped area. Now I'll put a bit of hot glue in this hole and stick the end of the rope in there. And with this, the wrapping of the stick opening is finished. Now little 𝗀𝗲𝗪𝗚𝗔𝗧𝗘 gets his ears. We have already sewn them together. So that we can sew them on right here, we first need to turn the edge of the fabric inwards at the turning opening. It's best to fold the seam allowance of the side seams apart so that you don't have such a thick bulge here on the side. Now I'm going to sew this together with a hand sewing needle. In the next step, fold the ears together in the middle like this. And sew the sewn together fabric edges at the former turning opening together again. A little tip. I've used a thick dark colored yarn here so you can better see what I'm doing. But if possible, you should of course use a thread in the same color as your fabric. The ear is now sewn onto the dart. Make sure that the side with the inner curve here on the top of the ear is facing towards the center of the head. To sew the ear in place, I now pull a thread here along the dart. The knot itself sits a little higher and the thread comes out at the end of the dart. The knot will later be covered by the ear, that's why it can be positioned up here. And now I stitch into the ear, approximately in the middle. And I pull the ear towards the dart, like this. And now I sew the bottom edge of the ear in place with lots of hand stitches. Here's another little tip. When you make these individual stitches to sew the ears in place, don't pull the thread tight until the end, but leave it a little loose, similar to the ladder stitch at the turning opening, because then you can stitch into the fabric much better. Once you have sewn down the bottom edge, sew the ear to the dart along this edge of the ear fabric, approximately up to 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter in front of the gusset seam. And now I push the needle to the back of the ear and sew 1 or 2 more stitches there. Then I knot the thread and cut it. This is how it looks now, and I do exactly the same with the second ear. When sewing on the second ear, please make sure that both ears are at the same height, not that one is further up or further down, so make sure that they are in the same position. So 𝗀𝗪𝗓 has finally got his ears, and I think you can now see quite clearly from these 2 hobby horse examples what the difference is between the ears sewn on by hand and the ears sewn into the darts. Because the ears sewn on by hand, like the ones of the fjord horse here, really stand straight up and are much closer together compared to the ears sewn into the darts of my dapple grey horse. Basically, both are great. You can choose one or the other, or you can simply make 2 different horses and do one this way and the other that way. You can work on the expression of the horse with the 2 different types of ears, and so it's also a really cool way to make slightly different hobby horses. And then I'd say it's on to the manes of the hobby horses. As there are so many options for creating a hobby horse mane, for example from human hair clip extensions or synthetic hair extensions, or the classic way using yarn. Either as a long mane or as a standing mane, which is then relatively short and sticks out, we have decided to make extra videos about this. We will link them all so that you can watch them individually, depending on which mane you have chosen. So I've now sewn on all the hobby horse manes for my 3 horses, and that's basically the end of our video. I hope you've made good progress and that by now you are holding a beautiful handmade hobby horse in your hands. If you have any questions or anything is unclear, just write to us in the comments or send us an email. We will definitely try to help you. And apart from that, I'd say have fun sewing your hobby horses, and hopefully I'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye.